So as Randy said, the institutionalization of foreign policy constraint. And I just want to sort of situate what I'm going to talk about and give you also a little warning at the beginning. This is a very, very preliminary project. It's really still in the theory building phase, but I have been working on one of my sort of 2 or 3 big areas of study is military manpower policies within the field of civil military relations. So I've been working on manpower issues for a really long time. But there is this larger literature of sort of public opinion and foreign policy. And the way that that relates to what we've been talking about for the last couple of days has a lot to do with sort of what Dan Dresner brought up in terms of the domestic constraints on grand strategic posture, including things like what Hal talked about, and then also just domestic constraints on foreign policy more generally. And the role that public opinion plays in these things. So, you know, what Sarah was talking about in terms of audience costs, and don't worry, I do point out that basically the audience cost, Bill, I do point out that the audience cost literature basically says that nobody needs to worry about this. So, so that's kind of the context. And I was thrilled yesterday to hear so many things that I thought connected to what I'm going to talk about today, you know, because Randy mentioned that the 2 days were a little disjointed, but I heard all kinds of things that I thought my talk might be relevant to. So I hope you find it interesting, even if it is very much down in some weeds. So I want to start off with the easiest framing of what I'm going to talk about, which is the Kantian logic that everyone is familiar with. The idea that Republican forms of government will be more peaceable because their leaders are accountable to the people who bear the costs of military activities, and people will generally support only those activities that are really, really necessary, very legitimate. So to rephrase this in sort of modern political science terms, the public expects costs from a proposed action, doesn't support the action. Again, Kant implies that there are some actions that the public would support, but that they're tiny. And this, as you might recall, is kind of the position that Randy was articulating yesterday, right? That there might occasionally be reasons to go to war, but probably not very often, and certainly not for places like Latvia, right? So this is very much like a Kantian expectation that in general, the public is not going to think that military action is worth it. And so then the leader is then supposed to anticipate being held accountable for an unpopular action. And so he doesn't do it. So that's the logic. Sorry, so many words on this slide, I apologize. But the main point being that there are several problems with this logic. The first one is that the public may or may not actually perceive the costs of military actions. And there's a lot of literature on this. Some of it looks at taxation and war financing. Some of it looks at information. You know, we've talked a little bit about how people get their information, where they get it, what information they get. Geographic distribution of casualties. There's a little bit of research on whether the proximity of news about casualties matters, and theoretically at least manpower systems. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But that's problem number one. The public may or may not even perceive the costs, depending on how those costs are structured. Second big problem is that as Chris Jelby and his co-authors and a couple of other people have done great work on, the public does make cost-benefit analyses, which Kant anticipated, but the public, at least the American public, on which we have more information than most other publics, may support even costly actions as long as they consider them legitimate. And it turns out, at least in the research that we have, that the public, the American public, I should say, is much more willing to consider a lot of things legitimate than Kant would have expected. Furthermore, and this is important, partisan identity and cues from partisan elites affect how the public interprets even the facts that they know and believe. And we saw a little bit of this in yesterday's discussion of how to perceive casualties, right? Is 200,000 casualties a lot? is it my fault? There are a lot of things, you can agree on the basic fact, you can agree that this many people are dead, but you can disagree on what that means, whether it's justified, etc. So the point of the second problem is that support is not necessarily tied either to real costs or even to perceived costs. The third problem, as Bill already brought up yesterday, is that the audience cost literature, particularly when you're talking about presidential systems, and again, this is something that Dan's talk emphasized in terms of the movement of power from the legislature to the executive in the United States, indicates that executives really don't have to worry about being held accountable for undertaking military actions that were initially unpopular. And then the last point that I want to make is that the Kantian logic really kind of leaves out the role of time in how public opinion matters for foreign policy decision-making. So what do I mean by that, the role of time? What I mean by that is that we're talking about at least 3 different periods of support where different things might matter for public opinion and public support. And the logic of audience costs matters in different places, okay? So you've got support before the mission when the leader is considering what to do. And I've listed the factors that, that the research indicates sort of matter for whether the public supports things before the mission. There's support during the mission. And again, I've listed the factors, and I've noted that a couple of very well-known effects like the rally effect definitely happen, but they tend to be brief. So it matters how long the action lasts. And then support after the mission, which is when you usually worry about audience costs, when you're usually worrying about punishment, although of course it can be an action that lasts through an election or something like that. So this isn't, you know, totally clear cut, but I would point out that, you know, usually you'd expect the costs to happen after the end of the mission, because that's when you can judge whether it was successful or not. And this is where, you know, Hein Goemans isn't here, but his wonderful work on sort of war termination points out very clearly that if a leader is in the middle of a military action and it doesn't seem to be successful, the smartest thing for that leader to do is just to keep going instead of to end it, because if you end it and people think it wasn't successful, then you really might get punished. And so that's how we get things like Afghanistan, right? Is that you just keep doing it because you're desperately hoping that you won't be the one who is seen as failing. Okay, and here I've just put, you know, so from the literature point of view, I think that we should be looking at different dependent variables for these 3 different phases of public opinion. You know, before the mission, you should expect public opinion issues to matter for mid-initiation, during the mission for mid-duration, and then after the mission for whether the leader gets punished or not. By the way, I am not going to look at that issue at all, although it would be pretty easy to do, I think. So maybe if I get the data, we'll see. I was supposed to get data this summer. That didn't happen.
I think she disconnected.
Yeah, we'll just got to wait. I think she might have to log back on. Let me see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah, don't worry about it. It's only been like a minute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
We can't see you yet.
All right. Am I back on?
You just have to join with video. Let's see.
The video might be more taxing though on the internet connection. Maybe
Hmm.
leave the video off. I don't know.
Right, we really just need the screen, so.
Let's get you unmuted first.
Okay,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Why am I echoing?
Hold on.
Yeah, you might need to disconnect and reconnect. It's because it thinks you're in two different versions of you in the call now.
Yeah, yeah, do that. Reconnect and we'll just wait. We'll wait. It's no problem.
It's okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but we can't see you though.
Ta-da.
There you go. You're up.
I'll
Okay,
just use
good.
this one. I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it. It's
Okay.
no problem.
I'll just use this one computer then. The video isn't as good, but that's okay. And you can see my wine rack, which I was trying to keep out of the video.
Well, yeah, that's what we need to know the whole picture. Go
And
ahead.
I'm sorry, I meant John, not Tom. Sorry. Okay.
We
so,
don't have your picture though. We don't have, I don't have your, I have you, but I don't have the, maybe it's me, maybe it's something else.
I think it's you, Randy. I can see her slides.
You can see the
Okay.
slides?
Yeah,
Okay.
You just gotta fiddle around.
Figure it out. Okay, go ahead.
okay. So my puzzle really comes from being someone who studies civil military relations and conscription and being constantly bombarded with people telling me that if only the US had conscription, we wouldn't engage in foreign policy adventurism. And I just got really tired of this because it's way more complicated than that. So what I wanted to do here was look specifically at how the structure of manpower policies and how variation in manpower policies can matter for this whole complex of public support, for cost perception, public support, and foreign policy constraint. So that's the one thing that I plan to look at first is variation in manpower policies. And my argument basically is that conscription, so the conscription voluntarism axis, which is the one that gets the most airtime, is probably not the most important one. So can we identify what it is about manpower systems that actually matter for the public perception of costs? I don't think that conscription voluntarism as an axis doesn't matter at all. It does, absolutely. But it's not the only thing that matters, and there are lots of variants that can happen that I think may matter more. And so the second question is, to the extent that costs are not the only thing that matters, right, from Chris and his co-authors' research and that of Bruce Gentleson, et cetera, do military manpower systems matter for public evaluation of those other issues? Things like legitimacy of the mission and the likely success of the mission. So back to that earlier slide that showed you sort of all of the factors that supposedly matter for public support, I've kind of just outlined the ones that I think different manpower structures might matter for. The expectations of success one, I've got a dotted line around because I'm really not sure. I mean, I'm not sure about any of these. This is just what I think, right? But the expectations of success one, there is some research on sort of whether people believe that conscript militaries are more or less effective, but it's not a very well built out body of literature. So that one's got a dotted line around it. But I do think that manpower policies could matter a lot for several of the factors that come into play before the mission happens. Okay, so theorizing military manpower, again, as I say, I don't think pure conscription voluntarism is the most important thing. What I think matters, what I'm proposing as a theory to be tested, is how much mobilization is necessary, and how does that mobilization or the manpower system in general distribute the burden? Does it change the distribution from less to more equitable, from more equitable to less equitable? Does it not change the burden at all? So in terms of mobilization, what you're seeing here is the fact that both institutionalized conscription, that is what Americans, US Americans would think of as sort of peacetime conscription, that is steady and constant and happens all the time, and that the US had really only for a very brief period between the Korean War and the Vietnam War. That was the only time in US history that we had peacetime conscription, in the sense that we weren't conscripting people for a specific military contingency. And then you have, so the point being that both conscripted and voluntarist systems can be either large or small as a baseline. And I think that it's this and not whether the mobilization is volunteer or conscript, it's whether there is a big mobilization that I think will make the public perceive costs, right? In the sense that you're more likely to perceive costs if there's a big movement from the baseline, just as a matter of psychology and, you know, prospect theory and all of that. So I've put in here that a couple of examples of each of these that I'm thinking of. And I've also put in, just as a sort of, you know, I think that this is what this would predict in terms of mid-initiation. And as you can see, the two low ones are the ones with small baseline forces. And that's because in order to initiate a mid in that situation, you'd have to do a big mobilization. Whereas in the other cases, if you already have large baseline forces, there are lots and lots of things you can do without the country ever noticing that you're doing them, right? And this goes back a little bit to one of the things that Bill talked about with the different types of defense budgets that you would see built for different grand strategies or grand strategic postures, right? The restraint model is the one that says, cut the military enormously, because then, you know, the sort of startup costs for entering a mid would be so much bigger and people would resist them much more. So I mean, this would actually be fairly simple to test. Countries with small baseline forces should have a harder time generating ex-ante public support for military actions, and countries with small baseline forces should be less likely to initiate mids. The equity one is the one where I'm significantly less sure about what to expect, and I'll explain why in just a second. But so I'm really just thinking through this, and I love people's comments and ideas about this. Let me just talk through this chart really quickly. So on the y-axis, you see the baseline situation. And what I mean by the baseline situation is the peacetime situation. Whether that is conscription or voluntarism, you can have systems, because, let me back up for a second. And this is for all the realists in the crowd. Militaries do not simply spring out of the air in response to external threats. They are domestic institutions, and they are extremely important domestic institutions. They matter a lot for political competition. They matter a lot in terms of the labor market. And so they are almost always at least half, if not more than half, in response to domestic political, structured in response to domestic political considerations and not just towards external threat. External threat matters, obviously, of course, but that is not the only thing that matters for the structure of a military. And so a state and a society are always going to make decisions about who is and is not in the military, who they want to be in the military and not to be in the military. And so what I'm arguing is, whether you're a conscript force or a volunteer force, your baseline could be either equitable or inequitable socially, economically, in terms of ethnicity, language, religion, all kinds of things, right? And then the x-axis is really the mobilization side, right? So if you are a volunteer force, you are still like having, did I freeze again?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Lindsay, you just cut out like about 30 seconds ago. Could you start that thought? Now you cut out again. Oh, no, you're not, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah,
okay.
We just lost it 30 seconds ago.
What was I saying?
Somebody?
Something,
If
something?
you have a volunteer force.
What?
If
Oh,
you have a
right.
volunteer force.
I've said that a lot. Okay. All right, I'll try doing this again really quickly.
Just back up a couple sentences from where you were. Just a couple
Okay.
sentences. What wasn't long.
So had I already explained the y-axis?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't that long ago. We would have told
Okay,
you.
great. So if you have a volunteer system, oh, I know where it was. If you have a volunteer system, you are still likely to need to use conscription if you have a really, really big contingency, like a world war or something like that. And so the x-axis is really about what happens during a major military contingency. And so what I'm looking at here is, you know, on the diagonal, you have sort of equitable and inequitable systems. And those are systems in countries, in societies where, you know, either the whole system is fairly equitable, everyone kind of recognizes its legitimacy, or, I mean, there are plenty of countries, I would think of Russia, for example, where the whole system is fairly inequitable and everybody thinks it's fairly inequitable, but that's just how it is. Turkey is another one. And then off the diagonal here, I've named these the US fantasy and the US reality blocks, mostly because I couldn't come up with a better, more neutral description for all 4 blocks. But I call these that because the lower left square, this inequitable voluntary system with equitable contingent conscription, is the one that I think most US Americans believe is the one we would have if we had a conscription system, right? Americans who believe that the current system, that the current volunteer system yields a fairly inequitable manpower cross-section, seem to believe very strongly that moving to conscription would mean a move to a more equitable system. The US reality square, on the other hand, is what I think would be more likely to happen, which is that we have a fairly equitable system right now with the volunteer force. It's fairly representative. And the type of conscription that the US has traditionally engaged in, with the single exception of World War II, has been very inequitable. So I'm trying to sort of crystallize what it looks like when you move from equity to inequity or the other way around. However, I have all kinds of problems with this that I need you guys to help me work out because it's really not clear what direction equity considerations influence public support. The Kantian logic, again, is that people care about self-interest, and therefore the larger and more equitable the defense burden is, the harder it should be for a leader to get support for an action, because more people in a broader cross-section, in a more representative cross-section, are thinking, hey, this is uncool, I have to pay a cost, and that should make them less supportive. But there is other research out there. Doug Kreiner and Francis Shen have written 3 or 4, they've written a book and a couple of articles, and there are some other things that feed into this, have argued that there is a normative effect in which the more equitable the burden is, the more legitimate the public sees the activity as, and the more likely they are to support it. So I honestly have absolutely no idea how this is going to play out, but I do think that how equity matters is going to depend on what we find as the mechanism that connects cost perceptions to support. And I know I'm running out of time, so I just want to really quickly, so Doug Kreiner and Jess Blankshane and I have done a study, which we're still trying to publish, that really indicates that cost perception as such may not be the main thing mediating public support, right? That in fact, what we find with our survey experiment, which I'm happy to talk more about if people want to hear about it, is that while expectations of aggregate costs, expectations of how large and costly the overall mission will be, does lower public support, and expectations of conscription lowers public support, the lowering of support from conscription is not mediated by an expectation of personal cost. In fact, those people more likely to think they will pay a personal cost through conscription had higher support for the mission than those that didn't. So, and also there was a large amount of movement in public support from the conscription treatment that had nothing to do, was completely unrelated to expectations of cost in any way. So what that implied was that US Americans just don't like conscription for some reason that you know, may have to do with norms of liberty and voluntarism, may have to do with the fact that it's unusual and something that we used to do a long time ago, but not what we do now. But anyway, the point being that I think there's a lot to be unpacked there in terms of the relationship, how perception of cost is actually tied to public support. So anyway, implications for strategy, implications for sort of the big picture stuff that we've been talking about here is, number one, I think, if I'm right about any of this, there is no silver bullet to fix public oversight or constraint of the executive in terms of foreign policy. You know, everyone is always looking for, you know, oh, can we just pass a law like the War Powers Act, or can we just institute conscription and then they won't be able to do these things? I really think that there is no such silver bullet. It doesn't exist. Second, and we already knew this one, even democratic leaders are significantly less constrained by audience costs than we think in terms of the way that leaders can manipulate public opinion. It's just, I think the audience costs aspect of the Kantian logic, at least, is really having trouble. But then in terms of grand strategy, and this goes back to the discussion we had yesterday, is that restraint as a grand strategic posture is, I think, difficult. And it's difficult unless, as Bill pointed out, unless you slash the military establishment just enormously. And I would point out that particularly for a state like the United States, which has, just as one example, I mean, we produce way more food than we could ever consume. We need international markets. We have to do international trade. It's almost impossible for the United States in terms of factor endowments to maintain the kind of standard of living that we have without international trade. And that makes it really difficult to stick to narrow conceptions of national interest, and makes it difficult for a country like the United States to credibly commit to a policy of restraint. So with that, I'll stop. And I really look forward to your questions and comments and all of your help in helping me figure out exactly what it is I'm trying to say.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to go in the order I see you two. So Alan, you're first.
Thank you, Dr. Cohn, for this interesting presentation paper, and thank you, Randy and Chris, for this opportunity to be a discussant here. So I've actually gone back and forth as to whether I should mention this, but my dissertation involves an audience cost component, which hints that it might not be as dead as people think it is yet, and I'd be happy to talk about that in great detail, but that's not the point here. So I really enjoyed this paper, right? Much of the literature in IR, and especially that focus on public opinion, has a tendency to assume that there is a military somewhere, and we can hurl that military at the enemy and just call it a day. Now, it may be costly. We know that the public doesn't like casualties. We know that the public may sometimes be willing to pay that cost. But where do those soldiers actually come from? We have surprisingly little to say about what the public thinks of the origins of MANPOWER, about who he thinks these fallen soldiers are. This is very timely, I think, because right now many Western but also East Asian nations have sub-replacement fertility rates, and now they maintain the population through, well, immigration rather than birth. Some, like South Korea, have already started revising their conscription policies to be more inclusive, and others will likely have to do so in the future. Since it's such a key component of citizenship, we should really care about this and how it informs immigration. If, as investigated here, people really do estimate different costs contingent on the flavor of military conscription, both in terms of content and origin, then this has important consequences, not only for the strategic context that leaders face, but also international bargaining, civil military relations, and general discussions of national identity. As you put it, the general Kantian argument is this idea that the value of the status quo minus the cost of inaction is greater than the value of action minus the cost of action. And so people simply don't want to support activities. They don't want to go and fight. And you very clearly indicate that conscription could affect this in two ways. It could lower the cost of action by simply depending on how the conscripts are raised. And it could also impact the value of action by making it more legitimate or making it more probable, victory more probable. Now, the problem, and that's what you were wrestling with in the discussion presented very clearly, I thought, is how do you separate the two? Now, we are two making comments, so John will be taking care of the temporality component, I believe, and I'll really focus on equity, which I found by far the most interesting part about this. Because it's not just about a specific policy, but it's where the respondent stands with regard to that policy, with regard to whether they are impacted by it or not. And I think there would likely be very important interactions between who the participant is and who that soldier that may die for the nation is in contrast. This is, obviously we've talked a lot about partisanship the whole time. This is obviously an important dimension, but also ethnicity or immigrant status would also be things that I think are probably very important. Now, there are two ways I thought that, two methods this could be done, right? The most natural one is, of course, survey experiments. You've done that with Jessica Blankshane and Douglas Krenner, but also there's the work by Horowitz and Lewandowski. I personally would not actually care too much about temporality, but I would really try to zoom in on what specific kind of soldiers or what specific kind of policy would actually impact most participants' responses. In 1971, Ted Kennedy decried that the all-volunteer force would be mostly poor, African-American, and uneducated. Now, 50 years later, we know that that's not true. Like, that is not what the all-volunteer force looks like today. But we also know that it is disproportionately Republican, it is disproportionately rural and from the South. And also, surprisingly, sure, there are fewer rich folks that you would expect, but the most underrepresented segment is actually the bottom quintile % of the population in terms of wealth. These are really all the variables I think would be best to include and try to understand, and also capturing them as control variables to see where it sits. To leave John some time as well, another method that I think would be interesting for this might be the formal literature on redistributive policies. So there's a fairly big chunk of literature on tax and redistribution, which is by far something I had never thought of with regards to conscription, but that you mentioned as being something close in terms of taxes and conscription. And I think that these literature have specific predictions they could make with regards to the kind of support we would expect or the kind of outcomes we would expect. For example, Romer, 1998, or Shire, 2009. And I'm happy to send all that afterwards. And I think that's about it. If there's one thing I'm actually kind of wondering what your thoughts were about is the role of militia. I have no clue how that could potentially be studied in surveys experiment nowadays. Because since we don't have that, and the point is to send the military abroad, right? What kind of scenario we could create to plausibly test what people think of the militia in this context. But other than this, I thought it was absolutely great, and I look forward to reading more about it. Thank you.
Great comments. Glad we got you back in. Lindsay, you just put this up, so you must have some, so why don't you just quickly, because I want to get John's face in, so.
No, I just put it up because Alan was mentioning that specific thing, so I just thought it would be supportive of his comments.
Okay, good, because I thought maybe you were putting up to make a point.
No, and in fact, I do want to point out one thing. it is a fairly popular narrative that the South is overrepresented, but I do want to point out that it is overrepresented, but it's overrepresented by a very, very small amount, right? The Southern overrepresentation is actually not, number one, it hasn't really changed over time that much. The South has been overrepresented in the military for a very, very long time, also during conscription. And also it's just, it's not a very big overrepresentation. It's not like everyone comes from the South and no one else comes from anywhere else. I just want to point that out. But I mean, Alan was absolutely on point, everything he said. Sorry, John, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, now we'll take this down so we can see John. And
Sure.
then if you want to
I'll
put
stop
back
sharing.
up, that's
I'll stop
great.
sharing. There we go.
Okay, go ahead, John.
Sure. Thanks, Lindsay, for presenting this paper. I think this is a really great paper because it's so early on, and that's when we can give a lot of really helpful feedback. It always sucks when you've run a lot of surveys and then you get results and then someone's like, why didn't you do that? Well, now you can actually have a chance to fix things or modify things. Alan touched on one of the points that I want to get to because I have two overarching points. The first is that I think this would be great for a survey experiment. I don't know if you already plan on doing that. The thing I wonder about though is because I see three factors moving around in your theory, right? We have whether it's conscription or volunteerism, and then the things you care about more, which is movement and baseline forces and how equitable for different recruitment, right, this is. I wonder if it might be best to run, like this might be a book length project or different papers. Like I think you might want to do before the war, like as you suggest during the war and then after the war. One of the things I wonder though is how you can believably, if you're working with an American sample, manipulate each of these factors without making it too obvious to the subject that that's what you're looking for results on, and creating a sort of like desirability effect. That being said though, and I think there might be a solution somewhere in here. I'm not fully familiar with this, but I do think the militia might actually be a good starting point. And I wonder if maybe this is the sort of design that might be best suited, not using, you know, the US military is doing X, but maybe doing something similar to what Katie Powers has done in the past, which I know she's here, where you create a fake country and you have people do a little bit of work so they believe that they are represented in this fake country and they take it seriously, and then manipulate things. So I think if you have the militia as your baseline group where the government has the least amount of interference in society, you can then move each of these factors around and see how much they have relative impacts on support for a war. Just an idea though, I was wondering what you were thinking of doing, if you had any, you know, hazy ideas about what this might look like. My second point has to do with equity as well, but even more so has to do with what happens after the war. So I think, at least in the paper that I read, it seemed like you dismissed the possibility that manpower policy could have an impact on how people approve or disapprove of a war after it's over, and that partisan cues will take effect. And I do agree that partisan cues certainly will take an effect, but I do wonder, and it's weird that I'm employing a selectorate theory logic because I'm a big psych guy, but I do wonder if your manpower policy is equitable, right, and that people have a lot to gain from serving, I do wonder if when the spin doctors on both sides come out and try to reframe the hazy war as a win or a loss, I do wonder if the people who had the most to gain from the war will be more likely to believe that it was a win. Yeah, I wonder if on the flip side, someone might believe it's more likely to be a loss if they, you know, got the cheap paycheck and all that. Overall, I think this was great, and I want to leave it up to the Q&A because I'm sure people have a lot of interesting things to ask or suggest. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, Randy, can I respond real quick?
Sure.
Okay, this will be really quickly. Thanks to both of you, and Alan already sent me some comments, and I would love to have more from both of you because I haven't designed the experiment yet, mostly because I wanted to do this first. But just to touch on John's last point, this sort of who is more likely to be susceptible to framing that it was a win, right? Yeah, this is something that Jess and Doug and I kind of found this in our experiment, and we don't know what to do with it yet. This idea that that people who serve in the military seem to have a need to, possibly motivated reasoning, need to believe that it was successful, and that it was legitimate, and that it was worth it. And their family members tend to believe this as well. The problem is we don't know whether that's motivated reasoning or a selection effect, right? We don't know whether the people who, we do know that people who believe that force is an effective tool for solving a broad range of problems are significantly more likely to go into the military than people who do not believe that, right? And obviously, like, if you don't think force is a terribly effective tool, it would not make a lot of sense to go into the military, or you may just not have thoughts about that. But definitely, if you have a more militarized mindset, your chances of going into the military are higher than those of people who don't have such a mindset. And so it may just be a selection effect, or it may be a motivated reasoning, backwards reasoning effect, or it may be both. I mean, who knows? Like, there's no reason those two things couldn't be happening at the same time. So that is definitely something that I will need to pay attention to. And I mean, it's something that I'd like to sort of try and figure out, like, what is happening there. But I don't know how yet. So send me ideas. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna ask, go to questions. So Chris Jelpy, you're up.
Oh God.
Is he your mentor?
He was on my dissertation committee.
Ah, or you, no.
Chris, you're muted.
Oh man, I should be good at that by now, but anyway. So thanks so much for the paper. I thought it was super interesting. Just a couple of quick sort of, I guess, suggestions. One is about this sort of idea of the different, trying to tease out what's the mechanism by which casualties matter. Mm-hmm. And I think there may be various different, there may be multiple mechanisms going on. One place that it occurs to me that if you wanted to get at this sort of personal cost mechanism, you could do is you could go back and get data on the Vietnam lottery, mm-hmm. and see if you could get data on attitudes of people and match it up with lottery number data. That would just be a real clean, like, randomized exposure to risk sort of way to test that mechanism. I'm personally skeptical that that's very much of it. And part of that is, seems consistent with what you were saying, part of which is because the sort of peak kind of casualty phobia in the United States, at least in sort of literature, is in the 1990s when, we're talking very small numbers getting killed and no risk of non-volunteers getting killed. I wanted to suggest, just to complicate things for you, a third possible mechanism. Which, so you and Kreiner are adding the normative, but I wonder if casualties are actually a signal of leadership competence. That the public forms some expectation about what's a reasonable number of casualties for an effective leader to suffer in a particular context. And if you start suffering more casualties than that, that's a signal that the leader is not competent in the way they're executing the war. And that may be the mechanism by which costs matter. So something to further complicate. But thanks for the paper, it's really interesting.
Thanks, Chris.
John Mueller?
Yes. Yeah, just to make just a couple of comments that you might want to take into consideration. One is the issue of in Somalia. The United States went in with a fair amount of approval. 21 soldiers got killed in the process of stopping a famine in Somalia, and everybody said, "Get the hell out," which Clinton did, and suffered no political ramifications for it. If you had said, these guys are all volunteers, the implication is people say, oh, well, hell, then, you know, they're not like me, so let them die. And it's just craziness to think that as well. In 1983, troops were sent into Lebanon by Reagan. And he said, this is the most important, the world peace hangs on the civil war in Lebanon. We have to stop it. 281 of them were killed by terrorist bomb. The immediate reaction was, let's get the hell out. If you had said some of these are volunteers, some not, it wouldn't make a damn bit of difference as far as I can see. Reagan then, who suffered this humiliating defeat, then was reelected handily late in 1984. And the other case about now getting more onto audience costs, which I already started, would be Vietnam. Vietnam was highly supported at the beginning, then of course it declined enormously. And then it came to an end in 1975 with probably the greatest debacle in American foreign policy history. I was around at the time, had written a book about it, and was really interested in what would happen in the 1976 election. And the war didn't even come up, except by Gerald Ford, who was running against Jimmy Carter, and he took credit for the debacle. He said, when I came into office in 1974, we were still fighting a war, and this is prepared in a debate in a prepared chunk, it wasn't just a casual comment. When I came in 1974, we were still involved in a war in Southeast Asia. Now we aren't. In the process, of course, and Carter could have said, yeah, we just lost the biggest foreign policy debacle in history. Instead, Carter started talking about, well, let's talk about farm price supports. In other words, it had zero impact on the election, and the guy who brought it up was the guy who presided over the debacle. Anyway, you might want to consider that. You got three.
Sarah wrote a book on that, didn't you? You wrote a book on that about accountability.
Somalia, Lebanon, and Vietnam.
Yeah.
Huge debacles, and there was no audience cost. Quite the reverse. If they'd stayed on, they probably would have had a lot of trouble.
Because as Sarah said, they didn't initiate the war. Isn't that right, Sarah? I got it. I got that punchline. Okay.
I'm so honored that you are familiar with my book. Wow.
I teach it in my class.
You do?
Yes, I do.
That makes my day.
That's why you see, even partisanship does not affect my ability to reason. Okay. Bill, go for it.
Yeah, I really like the presentation. I have a kind of a question and a comment that don't go to the thing that you really want, which is help on designing a survey, which of course is something that I'm not an expert on, and really can't have clever ideas for getting at what you want. But I did have one comment, and it does riff off of what Ben Yu here says in the Q&A about, you know, America's more or less constant war fighting since the end of the Cold War. Obviously, these are smaller wars in Vietnam and Korea during the Cold War, but it's more or less constantly being at war. Yet when we think about the meaning of this in terms of constraints, all of the objective indicators are one thing, but what about the kind of normative veneration in which military service people are held? It's kind of a almost, just to back up here, we have a lot of military veterans here at Dartmouth. The former president, Jim Wright, was an ex-Marine, and he did a special program where we get a lot of combat vets in here. And there are many of these guys I know. I've gone drinking with them occasionally. And of course, it's Dartmouth, so you have to go boozing with them. And they find a lot of the rhetoric around vets kind of ridiculous and over the top. But at any rate, this country has been more or less constantly at war, yet the political hagiography of military service is, I think, amazing. So I wonder if there's any cross-national research that captures the emotional, political resonance of military service in comparative societies. My hypothesis going would be there are few countries, including another country I studied, Russia, and Russia's been military active recently, and they have a lot of veneration of their service in, but I think we take it even further than the Russians do. So anyway, I think that would be a valuable piece of information to have cross-national research on what level of veneration, I'm trying to find the right words, society holds service members. And yet, despite what I would hypothesize would be a relatively high value on that variable here in this country, nonetheless, we've been at war a lot, at least in terms of the number of years at war since the end of the Cold War. The second was, I just wanted on the equity thing to mention some research that follows from some of Alan's comments, I think, which, and also the slides that you showed, which is there's this paper by Mauro Gili and his co-authors that shows, again, about the sort of more data on the myths about American service members and the relative levels of education and sort of value to society that their loss would entail. And I would add to that, again, what my veteran friends tell me, which is in the branches that are the most active in combat. Actually, if you look at the social economic statistics of those people, they're at the right end of the distribution. So essentially, the people who are dying in all of these wars tend to be really not at all like the stereotypes that people have. So all of this lends itself to kind of supportive of the thrust. I think of a lot of what you were saying was that the constraints is not, despite these really high emotional attachments to veterans, despite the fact that the people going in there are, really just, at the center of society and so on and so forth. They're not sort of dregs or whatever people are saying, lumpen, nevertheless, they don't seem to stop the United States from fighting a lot of wars.
Bill, it's not your social drinking we're worrying about, it's your private drinking. It's like Japanese militarism. We don't care if they militarize social. Lindsay, go ahead. Take as long as you want. Well, you got 10 minutes if you want.
How much? Okay. Oh, this is fabulous. Thank you all so much. Okay, let me start with Chris. And you have no idea what a relief it was for you not to come in and be like, this is terrible. So there is research actually that looks at the lottery numbers, and they do find that that people who are more exposed to the risk of being drafted through a lottery have lower support for the operation. I mean, this is part of the problem with a survey experiment, right? Doug and Jess and I did a survey experiment that's like, imagine if somebody said you might be conscripted. And that's very different from actually being like, how do you feel about the fact that your lottery number is very low and you could be conscripted? Those are just two different things. I don't know. Anyway, the point being that Horowitz and Lewandowski, the research on lottery, on the actual Vietnam data, all of it finds that when there is a prospect of conscription, people's support goes down. The problem is that we don't know exactly why. And even this idea, so that it goes down both when you're actually confronted with the possibility of conscription and when you're just confronted with the idea of it. It may be that it's going down for different reasons in those two situations, but it always goes down. And what we found was simply that the expectation of personal cost didn't explain all of the going down. And so, in fact, it didn't explain very much of it at all. So I don't know, but there is some work on that. I can do more. Good idea. The casualties as a signal of leader competence. I think that would have probably been a stronger mechanism before the polarization phenomenon, right? I think at this point, the level of political polarization means that your evaluation of your leader's competence depends significantly more on your co-partisanship than it does on any sort of objective measure of how many casualties you thought this mission should have taken. I mean, you guys know that people are really bad ex ante at estimating how many casualties will happen, how many casualties ought to happen. You try and ask people beforehand, how many casualties is it worth to protect Bosnian Muslims? You're not going to get a very meaningful response, I don't think. So I think that's definitely worth thinking about, but I have the feeling that partisan polarization may eclipse that particular thing. John, Dr. Mueller, so yeah, I mean, I think that everything you said to a certain extent kind of goes along with what I'm saying, in that the people in the instances that you mentioned, specifically Somalia and Lebanon, I don't think the American people would have cared necessarily that much whether those people were conscripts or volunteers. What they cared about in those cases was it a success? And that is partly objective and partly comes from leader framing. You know, Corey Dorber did a really, really interesting paper on the Mogadishu incident, in which she basically showed that before President Clinton came out and said, this is a disaster, public opinion was actually sort of 50-50 split on whether we should, you know, go kick their butts for having killed some of our guys or get the hell out. It wasn't until after the elite framing happened that public opinion, that public support for the mission in Somalia really tanked.
No, there was support for it because there was a hostage and they were supporting getting the hostage out. Once the hostage was gotten out, then support dropped.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So I think that, you know, the issue of success mattered a lot there, much more than the question of whether the troops were voluntary or conscript. So that actually goes along.
Now, what mattered there was the stakes. You asked people how many lives is it worth to save another Somali. The answer was there's nothing we could do that would be worth the life of a single American soldier. About 70 or 80% saying that.
Right.
John, I'm just curious, do you disagree?
It isn't worth it.
John, I'm just curious because I know what you've written on this because it was a footnote, I think, in an article that I think you think that that was a successful mission. Like, so do you just—
It wasn't. It was to stop the famine. Because it's gold.
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, how many lives do you think it's worth? I'm just curious, just
maybe 21.
21. Okay, but 22 is—
The point is the success, the stakes versus the cost. And so some things like after 9/11, obviously they're willing to spend a lot of money, a lot of effort and lives to get back at Al Qaeda. So the stakes matter and the cost matter, cost and benefit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Chris has his hand up. He wants to respond.
I guess, and you know, this has all been hashed out in print, so we may not need to redo it all again. But I just want to say for the record that I still disagree with John and agree with Lindsay. And would just, in specifically, John, I would say that I disagree with the idea that the mission was viewed as a success because the goal of the mission had shifted by the time that operation occurred, so that they'd moved away beyond just doing famine relief, and also were trying to, you know, rebuild Somali politics. And the fact that this raid happened and then Clinton got up and said this is a disaster meant people decided, oh, you know, this must be a disaster, and so we should get out. So
Okay, so but the other point that Dr. Mueller made was that in many of these cases, not all of them, but in many of these cases, the leader did not suffer any audience costs even for losing a lot of people. So I think that's a really important point as well. Bill, oh God, I could talk to you about this all day, honestly. But just to answer your specific question on, is there cross-national research on this veneration of troops? So this is one of the other things that I look at, is confidence in the military. And there is, in fact, a lot of really exciting cross-national research being done on this right now. There was a great paper at APSA on how new militaries build up popular confidence when they haven't actually done anything, right? Because one of the theories is that militaries get venerated because they're so good at what they do, so good at being militaries. But they were looking at cases in multiple African countries that had, you know, had massive changes of government and brand new militaries that had no sort of operational successes to their names. And yet within 9 years, those militaries were the most trusted institutions in society, public institutions, right? So the bottom line is we have no idea why this veneration exists. Like there are a couple of possible reasons, but there's really no consensus as yet, even within the United States. We know that, you know, obviously the Watergate in Vietnam was the beginning of a long downward trend in confidence in government institutions, but the military is the only one that sort of kept trending up. We do know that there is a partisan dimension of that. And we know that in other countries, even European countries, which are, you know, generally not very militarized societies, militaries have a fairly high confidence rating from the public, but they're not salient institutions, right? So it's like, do you trust the military? And people are like, yeah, I guess, I don't know. So this veneration, but I love the point that you make about the fact that as much as we venerate our military personnel, it doesn't stop us from sending them off to die in various places that don't seem to have existential importance for the United States. So I will definitely, I'm going to try and work that in. Yeah. Oh, the other point that you made, Bill, that I thought was really, really important and does go back to sort of my work on military manpower systems is this idea of the value to society of the losses that we would suffer. And this is one of the things that actually does tend to differ a lot by volunteer versus conscript systems, depending on how you do them. Because in conscript systems, at least the way the US tends to do conscript systems, you can select the least valuable people into the military, which is what we did largely during most of the wars that we fought, partly because you need the economy to continue to run, and partly because for most of that period we didn't have, you know, the sort of extremely high tech stuff. We can't do that anymore. You know, the military that we have at this point is significantly more highly educated than the average American. Even the enlisted force is you know, steadily, consistently 10 points higher in terms of high school graduation rates than the average American. And of course, the officer corps all have bachelor's degrees, which is significantly higher than the normal 30 to 33% of the American public. So you're talking about a significant amount of human capital in the current all-volunteer military that we have. But that's a choice on our part. That's a policy and societal choice. Volunteer systems don't have to be sort of high opportunity cost like that. Anyway, I'll shut up. There might be more questions.
I want to get some. Katie, you have a question?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks again for a fantastic presentation and paper and sort of the broader theoretical framework you're building. I find just super compelling and interesting. I have one question for you that's related to a point that Bill made in the conversation you were having about veneration of the military, and one that's actually about the thing that you presented. So the first one is, I was just curious, since you have some expertise on this, do we know anything about variation in veneration by countries where there is conscription and mandatory, like 2 years of military service, versus those where there is not? And so I'm thinking of like places like Finland, where everybody, or at least all the men, have to go and serve their 2 years in the military. Whether or not there's a difference between whether they actually sort of venerate the military versus simply have confidence in it. I suspect there's something there. I suspect there's some variation there, but I have no idea. I just find it interesting. The second thing on your actual paper, I'm perhaps a one-trick pony, and so I don't think that self-interest explains most of anything in public opinion, and so I'm totally persuaded that what explains this variation or the decrease in support for conscription has much more to do with sort of people's moral and emotional responses to this. And specifically, you can imagine some idea that it's simply wrong that we should require people to go out and die. And I'm curious that, like, one way to get at that might be to try and do something to manipulate it directly so that people's self-interest is not implicated. And the like first thought that came to mind was, well, if you're surveying primarily women and telling them that all the young men are going to have to get conscripted, maybe you're going to see they're still going to decrease support, but of course there's no direct self-interest implicated in that. They might have family interests and things like that. But there could be some way in which you could direct those manipulations at a group of people where it's clear and credible that they would not be implicated in the group that's conscripted, to start teasing that apart. Again, that's an ill-formed idea, but hopefully it gives you something to go off of. Thanks.
I have one quick question. Just equitable, when you use the term equitable, how are you defining that? Is that just simply a demographic thing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Randy. I wish you hadn't asked that. But yeah, I mean, in this particular case, it's very squishy. In this particular case, I'm thinking mostly about socioeconomic status in terms of, I mean, that's how I would start out. There are lots and lots of countries, though, where the question of equity would be more about sort of religious groups, you know, ethnic minorities. I mean, obviously, ethnic minorities are, or minoritized groups in this country are a big issue for sort of equity as well. But I was thinking primarily about socioeconomic status, because that's where the literature on war financing focuses as well. And so it's the easiest one to parallel.
Yeah, that's all. I just want a clarification, because would it be possible to conceptualize equity in terms of, to say, if we compensated them with money, like if we paid them a real lot to be our warrior class, would that be equitable, even if the distribution was wildly skewed in some direction, you know, even ethnically, racially, or would it just still be inequitable, you know?
I mean, honestly, that's a question for every society to answer for itself. I think this society has come down sort of a little bit further on that side of the spectrum than many more egalitarian societies, which would consider the substitution of money for risk to be not as fair. I think the US society is more okay with that. But even US society, you know, even US society, there is a good chunk of people who would look at a system where, you know, compensation was very, very generous and ended up they would look at a system like that as being almost predatory on poor people because they didn't have other options, right? So I think it's a complex question.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because you're making it a cultural question. I think that's quite right in some ways, that maybe American ethos is very much into, like, we can pay for, you can buy anything except love, maybe, you know. That's not even true. We know that's not. But anyway, yeah.
Can I answer Katie's question? Thank you. So Katie, two things. Number one, yeah, the targeting of non-risk people is actually kind of difficult, because, I mean, you can do it with age groups, right? That's the easiest one to do. But what a lot of the research has looked at, of course, is not just personal risk, but also the risk to family members. So you mentioned surveying mainly women and telling them only men would be conscripted. Then we have to worry about mothers, right? Not just mothers with conscription-age sons, which Horowitz and Lewandowski actually looked at a little bit, but mothers with any children who might empathize with the idea of, you know, so it's difficult to do that, but there are things that we can do to manipulate that. The other question that you asked, though, and I love that you asked this, is when military service is more normal, do people venerate the military as much? This one's a tough one to answer, and this is something I didn't get into in my presentation at all, but I have a big project going on, which is what factors lead a country to choose conscription and what types of conscription they choose based on that, because all of this is endogenous, right? Countries don't choose voluntarism or conscription out of a hat. They make these decisions partly based on economically what they can generate, partly based on socially what they can generate. So it's really difficult to say whether sort of normalizing military service will make people venerate them less. What I can say is that the mere difference between conscription and voluntarism doesn't make a difference there. So for example, lots of European countries had conscription, some of them still do, for a long time, but the baseline forces was so tiny, you know, the military participation ratio was so tiny that they were effectively volunteer forces, because if you didn't really want to, you didn't really have to. And so even though the expectation of thinking about military service was widespread, every young man, and in some cases now young women, had to spend 10 seconds at least thinking about, do I want to do this or not? And if not, how do I get out of it? Those societies, yeah, I mean, there aren't any societies really that venerate the military the way the American society does, right? Well, I mean, maybe there are, like North Korea possibly, but there are very few that venerate the military the way we do. Most of them are sort of, in the, yeah, they seem like a good institution, they seem trustworthy, they seem like decent people. And it's really, really hard to tell which is the chicken and which is the egg in terms of, like, do we have conscription because we don't think military service is that big a deal? Or do we not think military service is that big a deal because everyone has to do it, so we all think it's normal? It's just very difficult to get at that. But I'm working on it.
I'm going to get two more questions. We got 5 minutes. Minsan and Sarah, in that order. Minsan, you're up.
Yeah, I'll just keep my comments really short. I have 2 comments. So I think this was raised earlier in other comments as well. We're talking about like cross-national military veneration. So in the case of South Korea, I mean, I'm not an expert in like military, but I'm speaking as a South Korean civilian. It seems like the role of the military in the history and the society matters a lot. So in the case of South Korea, because we were under a dictatorship for decades, and the militaristic culture is just so embedded in the society, and it's seen with very negative connotations come with it. So I think that's a very interesting question. Like, we are, like, South Korea is basically still technically at war with North Korea, and yet I think we don't see that veneration that you see, like you said, in the U.S. society. And second comment is that I'm not sure if this will be relevant or helpful in developing your draft, but there's this book on moral victories, the ethics of winning wars, edited by Andrew Home, Kian O'Driscoll. I think you might have like heard of this, but they actually look at what victory means to different people. So it's a very like war is very effective, right? It's a lot about emotions, and so I don't know, like maybe this might be something that you might want to like take into account when you look at what Americans think of war and victory. Yeah, that's all.
Okay, I just had 2 quick points too. I'm sure you're aware of this book, but Jay Lyle did a talk in one of my classes, and his new book just came to mind several times as you were talking about, diversity in the military, and that's what his book's all about. And then also when I was doing work with Hugh and Ben Valentino on civilian casualties, we talked a lot about this, kind of equity burden and who's actually bearing the cost. And one thing that Ben and I kicked around is the idea of the people who are actually making the decision might not be exposed to the same risk as actual citizens. And so, but we see this, right, where leaders try to highlight this, like if they have a son or daughter in the military, right? Biden brought this up in the debate, Pence brought this up in the debate, as it tries to make their connection and their respect for and sensitivity to the costs of having a family member in the military. This is not related to this part. This is maybe like a spin-off if you wanted to do, where you could see if people were more respectful or believed that the leader was taking risk into account more if they actually had a child who was in the military. Because you see it brought up a lot, and I know we can't expect all members of Congress to have kids of the right age or whatever to be in the military, but it's just interesting to me when leaders bring that up as like something that makes them more sensitive to it. But that's a future project. So.
Yeah, great. Both of so Minsan, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, South Korea is a super interesting case for me, especially so the context in which I usually bring up the South Korean case is to show that just having conscription doesn't create the kinds of constraints that are often theorized, in the sense that, for example, when the South Korean government has needed to use the military for internal repression, it has simply brought in units from other regions of the country so that they are not, not sort of direct feeling like they're fighting with their neighbors. And it's just but yeah, the militarism of society is again, I don't think we really fully understand how those relationships work. So yeah, great example. Thank you for the recommendation on the book. I will definitely take a look at that. Sarah, oh, leader risk. Yeah, so this is a big part of this whole narrative, right? Is that if only the people who made the decisions had to worry about this the way us poor little peons have to worry about it, right? And what's interesting about that narrative is that actually the political leadership class in the United States has fairly strong family ties to the military. There are disproportionate numbers of veterans in Congress. And of course, as we know, children of veterans significantly more likely to serve. But the elite group that has no ties to the military at all, I bet you can all guess, business. Business elites have almost no family ties to the US military. So that's fascinating to me because again, like this theory, which is totally plausible, right? That if only political elites had to worry about risking their children, they wouldn't make these stupid decisions. They wouldn't send them off to do dumb little operations in places that Americans can't find on maps, right? But that doesn't seem to be the case. The political elite have these connections, and in many cases play them up, as you say, to point out how they are thinking about these things, and they still found it a good idea and legitimate, and so you should support it too. Whereas the business elites, and this comes into play with John Cavali's work and Sarah Krebs's work on taxation and military operations, they're the ones who will pay the costs of progressive taxation if for war costs, if we ever used taxation for war costs, which we don't anymore, basically. But they're the ones who would pay those costs, and they have no connections to the military at all. But anyway.
You have a paper on that, by the way?
What's that?
You have a paper on that last point about business?
Do I have a paper? No, there are 3 recent books: John Cavali's Democratic Militarism, Sarah Krebs's Taxing Wars, and Rosella Capella-Zielinski's How States Pay for Wars. All really, really good on that.
Yeah. I know John Carr. I know those. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, John. And we will come back at, we're going to take a break. We'll be back at 12:45 with Chris Jelpe.